Alrighty, my friends, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. We are moving along quite quickly here. Chapter 21, the Progressive Era, where we are progressive and we change stuff. 1890 to 1920. Okay, look, I'm gonna be better here. Yay! Oh.
During the late 19th century, a wide array of reformers across the country emerged to address many social issues that had resulted from the rapid urban and industrial development of the United States in the decades after the Civil War. Some of them were concerned about the growing power of huge corporations. Others focused on corruption in local, state, and federal government. Still others were concerned about the chronic problem of agricultural distress across the nation, created by low crop prices. Still others were more interested in what might be called moral issues. That is, one of the largest reform organizations feeding into the progressive movement was an effort to prohibit the use of alcoholic beverages across the country. Some reformers addressed the problem of child labor, of children working in textile mills and steel mills and coal mines. And finally, one of the most energetic elements of the reform impulse flowing into progressivism was the continuing desire to give women the vote. Taken together, all of these varied efforts came to represent the progressive movement, a transforming effort to reform and improve and raise the quality of living for all at the turn of the 19th century.
Alrighty, progressive reform. Alright. So social unrest at the end of the 19th century bleeds over into the 20th century. And now business owners are more interested in securing changes to avoid the problems they had experienced beforehand. So this is known as the Progressive Era. It is marked by growth in the middle and upper middle classes. Populism was one of the catalysts of this era. The publications of the Mugwumps on the reform of the civil service shifted the focus of society to ways to reform and improve the systems that affected them daily. So there's a lot of things that kind of lead to this progressive era and progressivism. Basically, people want change. People need things to be reformed. They want things to be a little more equitable, which we are coming out of a time that is not equitable at all. And honestly, we're going into one that's not equitable. But anyway, moving on. So the state was the first entity to see a need for regulating big business and working conditions. Many of these states' actions were overturned when the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to thwart such efforts. Investigative journalists would find a career reporting on the working conditions that many an American was subject to as price of their employment. They would be termed muckrakers. And there are several. This cover features Ida Tarbell's muckraking series on the Standard Oil Company. So she kind of breaks up in Standard Oil, kind of alerts people to that problem. Through the social gospel, Christians and Jews provided the crucial source of energy for progressive reforms. Relying on the teaching of their faith, they worked to promote laws such as establishing a minimum wage and a shorter workday. One principal reformer was Washington Gladden. He was a Congregationalist minister in Springfield, Massachusetts. He argued that the greatest thing Christianity should emphasize is the teaching to love thy neighbor as thyself. His publications and teachings would make him a leader of the reform movement. Alright, Settlement House, Hull House, Jane Addams, Ellen, what's her middle name? I've just forgotten. Ellen Starr. I can't remember her middle name right now. It is swept out of my brain. Anyway, to combat the slums and tenement houses, workers such as Jane Addams and Ellen... Why do I say Gates? But I think that's right. Anyway, Ellen Starr created residential community centers known as settlement houses. These facilities are mainly staffed by middle-class, college-educated women who had few other outlets for meaningful work. They work to improve the lives of their dwellers through meeting their practical needs, such as arranging for nurseries, for working women, kindergartens, and neighborhood programs for children. And this idea of the settlement house and all that is actually where social work as a career comes to play. And colleges start actually teaching courses and allowing people to get degrees in social work at this point. All right, so which of course for women, of course. With the rise of industrialization, women soon become more common in the workplace. Not that women are ever common. By 1910, 7.8 million women worked outside the home. 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association to secure nationally the right of females to vote. 1869. When does it happen? Yeah, 60 years later. They would not be successful into the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This is Jane Addams. By the end of the century, religious groups were taking up the settlement house movement. This is San Francisco suffragists marched across the country in 1915 to deliver a petition calling for a constitutional amendment with more than 500,000 signatures to Congress in Washington, D.C. Anybody know what's going on in 1915? Yes, my friends, a world war. No, we're not involved in it yet, but we're going to watch Iron Jawed Angel, and you'll kind of see how that plays into World War I and what's going on here in the United States. So this is women's suffrage, 1869 to 1914. All of those pretty orange states do not have full women's suffrage by 1914, and many of them don't get it until the amendment comes through in 1920. The lighter green, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, they have full women's suffrage between 1869 and 1916. 1869 and 1896. All right. So selection of party candidates had, since Andrew Jackson's era, been held at a national convention of party members. During the Progressive era, the system would be supplanted by the direct primary system, in which every party member was allowed to vote for a candidate. So very similar to what we do today. Also during this time, the initiative and referendum were introduced, and some states were allowed to directly pass laws or force a legislator to consider legislation. 1911, the concept of Taylorism was introduced, which promoted efficiency in the workplace to allow workers to accomplish more during less time. Efforts under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 to control big business had proved more symbolic than effective. Attempts to reestablish small firms in areas in which a trust had a monopoly failed. Attempts to secure social justice were rampant during this time. Efforts to regulate child labor and consumption of alcohol, and the creation of more hygienic cities were major issues. Very exciting times. Alright, this is Frances Elizabeth Willard. She founded the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and lobbied for women's suffrage. Child workers shuck oysters in 1913 at the Varn and Plant Canning Company in Bluffton, South Carolina. No child labor laws. You would not see that today. Faux show. Alright. Christians and Jews would find much in common, liking progressivism and religion. Oh, linking, not liking, linking. Another aspect of progressivism was the Prohibition movement. Reformers hoped that closing saloons and making alcohol legal would deprive political bosses of a valuable tool for recruiting people to their cause. Yep, doesn't work that way. Anyway, 1902, Roosevelt embraces a square deal for Americans, in which the regulating of existing antitrust legislation would be upheld and more powerful enforcement powers would be established. Roosevelt would often support the regulation of trust over their dissolution, as he viewed this to be more efficient. When coal workers in Pennsylvania and West Virginia went on strike until a 20% pay increase was granted, Roosevelt did not follow in Rutherford Hayes' and Grover Cleveland's footsteps. They had immediately sent in troops to restore the mines. However, Roosevelt attempted to broker a resolution between the two sides until the owners refused to accommodate. Only then did he threaten to take over the mines, which caused the owners to relent. So he really tried to work things out. He was really good about trying to make sure things were fair, and that the public good was being served. And he did care a lot about people. So, although altogether Roosevelt's administration initiated nearly 25 antitrust suits. Through these cases, the Interstate Commerce Commission, created by the Sherman Antitrust Act, was further strengthened and made more relevant. Remember, the Sherman Antitrust Act comes in to make the Clayton Antitrust Act more powerful. Did I get that backwards? No, I think it's okay. Anyway, government inspectors closely examined tainted sides of beef at a meatpacking plant. That is Upton Sinclair in the Jungle, my friends. Talking about the meatpacking industry, which brings in regulations in 1906. The Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Act. So, thank you, Upton Sinclair. My belly thanks you. As do all my other digestive systems. Alright, 1904, the Republicans nominated Roosevelt for his first term as president. So remember, he takes over McKinley's presidency very early on. So he's already served 3.5 years. But 1904 is going to be his first election. He would defeat the Democratic Judge Alton B. Parker by an extremely lopsided victory. Roosevelt would use his mandate as a reason to further pursue his progressive policies. He would attempt to regulate railroads, meat packers, food processors, and drugs and patent medicines. President Roosevelt's greatest legacy comes in the form of conservation of public lands. He gives us the Grand Canyon. Thank you, Roosevelt. I enjoyed it. Under his administration, Yellowstone National Park was created, and the Division of Forestry was established to control the national parks. Special programs to provide for the distribution of water to the arid West were also approved. Big conservationalist, even though he liked to kill big animals. Alright, this 1906 cartoon likens Roosevelt to the Greek legend of Hercules, who as a baby strangled saints sent from hell to kill him. Here the serpents are pro-corporation Senator Nelson Aldrich and Standard Oil's John B. Rockefeller. Alright, Roosevelt would step down after his first full term and support William Howard Taft as a Republican candidate in the 1908 election. They were friends, and Roosevelt fully thought that Taft was going to support everything he wanted him to do, basically. So the Democrats once again nominate William Jennings Bryan, the poor guy, he just can't get a break. Taft easily defeats Bryan. Once in office, Taft departs from Roosevelt and the Republicans on tariff reform and supported lowering it. And this causes a problem. Roosevelt really thought Taft was going to go through all the things that he wanted, basically, kind of come in and be his little mentee, and Taft doesn't do that. He does not have Roosevelt's political skills, and he ends up alienating the Republican Party, and it signs a tariff bill that makes things worse. Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, was opposed to Roosevelt's establishment of national parks. He would open up land for the construction of water power sites that had been marked for conservation. At the same time, he opened up land for coal mining companies that sold some of the land to other developers. Pinchot reported this to Taft, who chose to do nothing. He then went to the press. Taft fired him for insubordination. You can still do that today. Insubordination. This is Taft speaking at Manassas, Virginia in 1911. Kind of a portly fella. Alright, immediately following Taft's inauguration, Roosevelt departs on an African safari that lasts 2 years. When he returns, he feels betrayed by Taft's departure from Roosevelt's plans. In 1912, Roosevelt was chosen by a group of progressive Republicans to be their choice for president in that year's election. The Republican Party renominated Taft. So basically you have a split of the Republican Party here. The division of the party between Taft and Roosevelt allows the Democrat the chance they had been waiting for, the winning of the White House for the third time since the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson would defeat both Taft and Roosevelt for the presidency. However, if the Republican Party had chosen only one candidate, it is very likely that one candidate would have won. A skeptical view of Theodore Roosevelt here, this 1912 cartoon, criticizes the Bull Moose Party for being just a sideshow. So, that's the Progressive Party, by the way, the Bull Moose Party. Wilson has served as president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey before winning the presidency. 1912 campaign, Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a mentally disturbed man before a speech. And although injured, he gave his speech anyway and commented that it took more than a bullet to kill a bull moose. This image was so vivid that Roosevelt's party adopted the bull moose as their icon, and Taft quickly lost ground. And Roosevelt gets more electoral votes, a lot more electoral votes than Taft does. Still, the division between the two Republicans allowed Wilson to win with a majority of electoral votes, though only a plurality of popular votes. So he does win both, but not by a lot. He wins by a lot of electoral votes, but not much on the popular. Wilson is the only president ever to hold a PhD. All right, so this is the breakup of the election in 1912, and you can see the blue is Woodrow Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt has the green, and Taft is the orange. But if you look at the actual popular vote, if you were add together Roosevelt and Taft, you have 7.6 million to Wilson's 6.3. So again, it is very possible that if they had not split, if they had just chosen one candidate, that it would have become a Republican president again. All right. If Roosevelt had been a strong president because of his personality, Wilson was strong because of his conviction. He would personally court members of Congress to his side to adopt his programs. Wilson's first test of leadership was the passage of the Underwood-Simmons Tariff in 1913. It reduced duties on most goods and lowered the average duty from about 37 to 29%. Also at this time, the newly ratified 17th Amendment was placed into effect, and a 1% tax on income over $30,000 was in place. So we had the 16th Amendment, which is going to be direct election of senators. 17th Amendment is going to be your income tax, and in a bit, probably next week, maybe, we'll talk 18th Amendment, which is going to be prohibition, and 19th, which is going to be women's suffrage. All right. The first major banking and currency reform since the Civil War, the Federal Reserve Act creates a new system of national banks and a central board of directors. This new system spread out the flow of currency and fixed most of the problems in banking. Well, until you have the big banks crashing in the 30s, but we'll wait. Wilson's presidential plan was known as the New Freedom. The chief aspect of this plan was trust busting. In 1914, the Federal Trade Commission was created with strong powers to regulate trust. Wilson was not a strong believer of social justice, as he believed if business could be regulated and controlled, society would adjust on its own. He showed little concern for the plight of African Americans. However, he did denounce the KKK for its reign of terror. Not necessarily a big supporter of civil rights, Mr. Wilson. Wilson and the First Lady ride in a carriage with African American driver. Oh, I missed that earlier. Sorry, people. Okay. Yeah, that's what I talked about, antitrust laws, progressivism for whites and whatnot. Alright, so here are our new freedoms, old rules. So who are our servants here? Alright. Women gained the right to vote in federal elections with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 following World War I, and the contribution made by women in the workforce. Oh, yeah. Wilson renounced his reservation about the amendment and publicly supported it. For a very long time, he did not support women's right to vote, and he was very publicly against it. So, although the number of women in the workforce climbed after the war, they were still principally in traditional occupations as secretaries, dressmakers, and clerks, so they had girls' jobs. Margaret Sanger was a nurse who pushed for the distribution of birth control. And you're going to learn a little bit more about Margaret Sanger when you read your Secret History of Wonder Woman book. Super excited. It is a feminist history, so should be interesting, hopefully. Well, I hope you are interested. I thought it was interesting. She distributed birth control information to women in the United States to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Super, super taboo. Super, super. She alienated supporters when she began to lobby for the forced sterilization of mentally incompetent people and those with certain hereditary conditions. People would still be against that today. That's kind of taboo. This is Alice Paul. We are going to watch Iron-Jawed Maiden next week, I think. Anyway, we'll watch it. And main character Alice Paul's played by Hilary Swank. Strategies of civil disobedience become increasingly militant. Here she shows a suffrage flag, which she often brandished at strikes and protest. So after World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, Wilson, who desired another term, returned his attention to reform. He promoted labor and farm reforms to shore up those areas. During this time, the 8-hour workday for railroad workers was upheld by the Supreme Court, and child labor was restricted for those under age 14. During Wilson's first administration, progressivism reached its high point. Alright, the first 20 years of the 20th century were a time of landmark reform, although also marked by a new wave of anti-immigrant nativism. Progressivism was largely a middle-class movement in which the poor, or those who chose not to organize, had no say. So, that is all I have to say today. We will continue with this next time, and I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening. See you soon, or just talk to you soon.